They laughed at his homemade grenade until he wiped out 31 Germans in one night. The night of December 14th, 1944, settled over the Hurtgen forest with a stillness that made every sound stand out. The temperature had dropped sharply after sunset, and the snow that covered the ground had hardened into a thin, brittle layer that cracked under any pressure. The tall pines blocked out almost all remaining light. The only illumination came from a faint, distant glow reflected off low clouds. In this darkness, the men of the U.S. 28th Infantry Division held a thin defensive line stretched farther than it should have been. Their job was simple on paper, but difficult in practice. Hold the forest edge, prevent infiltration, and report any German movement toward the supply routes behind them. The ground was uneven, broken by shell craters, uprooted trees, and frozen mud. Their platoon, reduced by weeks of fighting, was operating with fewer men than a full-strength squad. Fatigue showed on every face. Most of them hadn't slept more than a few hours in 2 days. Private First Class Daniel Danny Mercer lay behind a low pile of logs and branches the men had assembled as a firing position. 19 years old, medium build, still carrying the look of someone fresh from training. He came from a small farm outside Columbus, Ohio. He had joined the Army after his older brother was drafted, wanting to help shoulder the burden at home. Danny had no special combat skills. He wasn't the fastest or the strongest in his unit. What made him different was that he understood machines. Back home, he had repaired broken tractor engines, harvested parts from old equipment, and found ways to keep failing tools working longer than they should have. That habit carried into his military service. While others cleaned rifles or rested, Danny sorted through scrap metal, empty casings, and damaged fuses left behind in abandoned German positions. Over the previous month, the platoon had suffered from shortages. Grenades were rationed, ammunition often arrived late, and damaged equipment couldn't always be replaced. Danny tried to solve this gap in his own way. He had created several crude explosive devices using whatever he could find: bits of mess kit metal, fragments of old grenade casings, powder scraped from misfired rounds, and a salvaged friction igniter from a dud German grenade. Only one of his prototypes remained intact. The others failed under cold or cracked at the seams. The remaining device was wrapped in cloth inside his pack, kept hidden except during the quiet moments he spent checking it. Corporal Frank Delecky crouched a few feet away, watching Danny adjust the crude fuse in the dim light. Delecky was in his late 20s, a steel mill worker from Pittsburgh before the war. He had experience working with tools and machinery, but unlike Danny, he didn't improvise anything unless he absolutely had to. He trusted standard-issue equipment and saw no reason to depend on anything made in the field. He respected Danny's persistence, but he didn't trust the homemade device. "Kid, that thing looks worse every time you take it out," he whispered. His voice was low to avoid carrying through the trees. "One day you're going to pull that fuse, and it's going to take your hand off." Danny didn't react to the joke. He kept checking the igniter with slow, steady movements. "It's for emergencies," he said quietly. "We're low on grenades. If things get bad, maybe it buys us time." Delecky shook his head. "We're ends the fight early, and not in our favor." Before Danny could respond, Sergeant Henry Lawton crawled over. Lawton was a combat veteran, tall, lean, and calm under pressure. He had fought in North Africa and Sicily and had been transferred to the 28th Division months earlier. He knew the terrain of the Hurtgen forest was unforgiving, and he understood that everything depended on delaying German advances long enough for the higher command to reinforce or reposition units. His task tonight was to keep his reduced squad alert, maintain the integrity of the line, and ensure no German infiltration slipped past them. "Quiet down," Lawton whispered. "Sound carries too far out here." He surveyed the men, tired, bundled in wool coats, rifles resting on logs, eyes fixed on the darkness. The squad's job was simple but critical: hold their position, observe movement, and prevent any enemy group from reaching the open ground behind them. If German troops slipped through, they could attack artillery crews or supply units further west. At 2:11 hours, the forest changed. It was subtle at first. A brief pause in the wind, a faint shift of weight on snow somewhere deeper in the trees. Then the unmistakable crunch of boots moving in controlled intervals. Someone experienced in night operations would recognize the difference instantly. Wildlife moved erratically. Patrols moved irregularly. What they heard was coordinated, measured steps from multiple individuals, stopping and starting with purpose. Lawton raised his hand in a silent signal. Everyone froze. Danny slowly lowered the cloth-wrapped device back into his pack and reached for his rifle. His breathing slowed as he listened to the pattern. More footsteps followed, closer this time. A low metallic click echoed, the sound of a weapon being repositioned. Danny could now make out several distinct sources of sound, spread out over a wide arc. Dalecki leaned closer to the sergeant. "That's no patrol," he murmured. Lawton nodded once. His face tightened as he calculated distance and numbers. "Stay down," he whispered. "Don't fire until they're close enough to see clearly." Danny pressed deeper into the snow, gripping his rifle. He tried to count how many footsteps he heard. 10, maybe 15 at first. Then more. The shape of the movement changed. Clusters advanced, paused, separated slightly, then resumed. That pattern meant trained infantry in assault formation. The narrator's voice continues. The men of the 28th Infantry Division were spread thin across the sector. They had limited ammunition and no reserves positioned directly behind them. If a German assault group broke through, there would be little to stop them from moving deeper into American lines. As the shadows in the distance grew clearer, Danny noticed movement far to the left and right, flanking elements working to encircle the American position. The Germans were approaching silently, confident in their ability to slip past the thin line. Danny exhaled slowly. He knew exactly what the squad was facing now. The line was about to be tested, and they did not have enough firepower to hold it for long. He felt the weight of the homemade grenade pressing against his side through the fabric of his pack. He didn't reach for it. He didn't intend to use it. But he knew the moment for improvisation was approaching much faster than anyone wanted to admit. The footsteps multiplied. Sergeant Lawton tightened his grip on his rifle and whispered one last warning. "Everyone stay ready. They're coming straight toward us." The forest fell silent again, just long enough to make every man on the line aware that the next seconds would decide everything. The Germans advanced in steady intervals, closing the distance yard by yard. Their outlines became more visible between the rows of trees. Rifles held low, helmets darkened, each man moving with practiced precision. Danny adjusted his position behind the log line, keeping his rifle angled toward the shifting shadows. Snow dusted the barrel as he breathed slowly to steady his pulse. Sergeant Lawton watched the enemy approach with a rigid focus. His job was to decide when the squad would open fire. Too early, and the Americans would reveal their position before the Germans were committed. Too late, and the enemy would reach flanking range and collapse the line in minutes. Lawton knew they had only a handful of rifle magazines, one functional grenade, and machine gun crew positioned too far to the rear to help in the first moments of contact. He weighed their chances carefully and lowered himself closer to the snow. Behind him, Private O'Shea checked the bolt on his rifle twice. Johnson, the youngest after Danny, tightened the strap on his helmet and pressed his back against a fallen trunk. The men exchanged no words. They only listened. They all knew what was at stake if the enemy broke through. Danny's ears picked up more movement. Another German group shifting to their left. The squad was facing more than a probing team. This was a full assault detachment, likely 30 men or more, moving with confidence in the dark. Their objective was clear: bypass American lines and reach the open ground where vehicles and supplies were positioned. Dalecki leaned close to Danny, his whisper barely audible. "They outnumber us 5-1. This isn't going to be a short fight." Danny didn't answer. His attention kept drifting to the side of his pack, where he felt the pressure of the cloth-wrapped homemade grenade. He tried to push the thought away. He had built that device for emergencies, not for the opening of a firefight. Yet as the Germans pushed forward in multiple elements, he knew they were running out of good options. A sudden shift in the German formation caught his eye. 3 figures separated from the main group, advancing along a shallow depression in the ground. They were creating a flanking column. If they reached the Americans' left, they would fire from an angle that the squad couldn't defend against for long. Danny's voice was low as he spoke to Dalecki. They're moving left. 3 at least. Maybe more behind them. Dalecki peered through the darkness. Yeah, they're trying to fold around us. Lawton's whisper traveled down the line. Hold fire. Let them come in further. It was a difficult command to obey. The Germans were now less than 50 yards away. Danny could hear their equipment rattling softly, the dull clack of ammunition pouches, the shifting weight of weapons. He tightened his grip on his rifle stock, bracing the barrel against the log. A faint German voice cut through the silence from deeper in the formation. Weiter vor. Langsam. Keep moving. Slowly. The squad tensed. The Germans were coordinating, not rushing. They were preparing to strike. Danny's thoughts moved faster than his nerves. He replayed the limitations in his mind. Ammunition low, squad undermanned, flank exposed. If the Germans reached 15 yards, the line would come apart before they could call for help. He felt Dalecki tap his arm. If they get any closer, we're done. Danny swallowed once. Sergeant, he called quietly, crawling closer to Lawton. We can't hold them if they flank us. We need something to stop their advance right away. Lawton turned. Even in the dim light, Danny could see the strain on his face. What are you suggesting? Danny hesitated. The idea he was about to say was the same one the squad had laughed at for weeks. But the situation left no space for doubt. That improvised grenade I made, it's all we have that might break their formation before they reach us. Lawton studied him. He had never trusted the device, but he trusted Danny's judgment. The boy didn't exaggerate. He didn't offer ideas unless he believed in them. And right now, there was no other option waiting behind them. How far can you throw it? Lawton asked. Far enough, Danny said. If I can get closer. Closer? Dalecki whispered sharply. You'll be right under their rifles. Danny kept his voice steady. If we stay here, they'll hit us from both sides. One shot from them, and we'll lose the position. If the grenade works, it might disrupt their flank and stop their advance long enough for us to fire back. Lawton exhaled slowly. He wasn't choosing between good options, only choosing between the ones that might give them a chance. After a long second, he nodded. All right, but you don't go farther than you need to. Keep low. Come back fast. Danny reached into his pack and unwrapped the cloth around the improvised device. The metal felt colder than anything else he had touched that night. The casing was uneven. The fuse assembly had small scratches from repeated adjustments. He checked it one last time, making sure the igniter wasn't frozen stiff. He had spent weeks shaping this device, not knowing if it would ever be used. Now he was about to trust it with 7 lives. He lowered himself to the ground, rifle slung across his back. He kept one hand on the grenade, the other gripping the frozen earth as he crawled forward through the shallow snow. Each movement was deliberate. His coat brushed against branches. His boots pressed carefully into the ground to avoid noise. He kept his head down, moving between tree roots and broken branches until he was 15 yards ahead of his squad. The Germans were close enough that he could see their breath in the air. They held MP-40S and Kar 98 rifles ready, moving with steady steps. One of them paused, scanning the darkness. Danny froze until the soldier turned away. He tightened his grip around the grenade. For seconds, that was all the fuse allowed. If he hesitated even half a second, the device could ignite in his hand. Behind him, the squad waited in silence, watching his outline disappear into the dark. The narrator's voice lowers. At that moment, the outcome of the entire position hinged on a single improvised device and the courage of a 19-year-old infantryman. Whether it worked or not, every man behind him knew they would soon face the full weight of the German assault. Danny positioned himself behind a fallen stump, preparing for the throw that could save them or fail completely. Danny stayed behind the fallen stump, pressing his body into the cold earth while listening to the Germans close in. Their steps were slow and careful, spaced evenly, communicating discipline and experience. He counted at least 10 men in the nearest group. More shifted behind them, harder to see but unmistakable from their movements. The forest floor transmitted vibrations in short pulses each time a boot struck the frozen ground. Danny lifted his head just enough to gauge distance. The Germans were now within 25 yards. Their flank element had moved farther left, preparing to wrap around the American line. Once they reached the defilade, the squad would be exposed from an angle they couldn't defend. Danny's time was almost gone. He positioned the grenade in his right hand, keeping his thumb steady on the igniter. Every adjustment he made was cautious and deliberate. He checked the angle of the throw he needed, high enough to clear a tree branch, low enough to land in the path of the advancing cluster, and far enough not to detonate too close to him. The situation offered no room for error. From his vantage point, he could hear the Germans whispering short instructions. Links weiter halt vorwärts. He recognized the tone, confident, controlled. These were trained assault troops, not inexperienced replacements. They were accustomed to night infiltration, moving in small teams, and using darkness as cover rather than risk large exchanges of fire. Danny waited until 3 of them stepped into a narrow gap between the trees. Behind them, more figures followed in staggered formation. Their spacing was tight enough that a single explosion could catch several at once. Danny steadied his breath. He removed his thumb from the igniter and pulled it sharply. A faint hiss sounded, the fuse igniting. He rose just enough to throw, but at the moment he shifted his weight, his left boot slipped on frozen moss hidden beneath the snow. His shoulder dropped, and the grenade left his hand at the wrong angle. Danny felt the air leave his chest as he watched the device arc off course, drifting toward the flank group instead of the center. He ducked back behind the stump and pressed himself flat. The grenade detonated before he could exhale. The explosion struck with a sharp, concentrated force. The sound echoed between the trees in a tight shockwave. Splinters, metal fragments, and dirt shot outward in multiple directions. Danny felt the impact of the blast through the ground. He raised his head only enough to see dark shapes collapsing inside a cloud of dust and debris. The device worked. The jagged fragments he had shaped from scrap metal tore through the flank group instantly. Several Germans dropped without making a sound. Others shouted in confusion, believing they had been ambushed by a powerful American fragmentation charge. Danny's improvised casing had created unpredictable patterns of shrapnel, hitting trees, roots, and bodies at uneven angles. The closest German shouted something that sounded like a panicked order. Deckung, weg to weg. Take cover. Get away. Danny didn't wait. As the surviving Germans scrambled for positions, he crawled backward and then ran the final stretch crouched low, keeping his head beneath the height of their rifles. He reached the log line just as a burst of MP-40 fire tore into the trees where he had been seconds earlier. Dalecki grabbed him by the back of his coat and pulled him to cover. Jesus, what the hell did that thing do? Danny didn't answer. He was catching his breath, his hands shaking from the cold and the adrenaline. Lawton looked at him with a mixture of surprise and urgency. Did it go off clean? The sergeant asked. It worked, Danny said. It hit the flank hard. They weren't ready for it. Before Lawton could respond, the remaining Germans opened fire in a chaotic volley. Their formation, previously precise, had fractured. Some fired blindly. Others shouted conflicting orders. The squad now had a narrow window of advantage. Everyone up, Lawton commanded quietly. Get ready. The Americans raised their rifles above the log line. The forest was filled with drifting smoke from the grenade, mixing with breath vapor and gunpowder. Danny chambered around and settled his rifle against the wood. The tension in the air was immediate. The Germans were regrouping, but still disoriented. Their assault pace had broken in less than a second. A German officer's voice rose above the rest. Zurückziehen? Nein. Sammel. Nach rechts ausweichen. Retreat? No. Regroup. Shift right. Danny saw figures shifting direction, trying to pivot away from the damaged flank. Their movements were no longer silent. Branches snapped under hurried boots. Snow kicked up as they stumbled to reorganize. This was the opening the Americans needed. Lawton whispered sharply. On my mark. The surviving Germans were moving closer, rifles raised, but their rhythm was gone. Danny steadied his breath, tracking shadows between the trees. Mark, 7 American rifles fired almost at once, followed by another volley seconds later. The crack of each M1 echoed through the forest, controlled, deliberate. German soldiers dropped or fell behind cover. Others tried to advance, but hesitated, unsure where the main American force was positioned. Danny fired until the rifle's recoil steadied his nerves. He saw 2 Germans attempting to pull their wounded comrade behind a tree. Another shifted to the right, trying to flank farther around. Each time, Lawton or Dalecki forced them back with precise shots. The explosion had done more than injure the flank. It had stopped the German momentum. Their coordinated infiltration had turned into a disorganized attempt to find cover and regain direction. Danny reloaded, sliding a fresh clip into his rifle. His hands were stiff from the cold, but steady. He listened for new movement, but the initial surge had halted. The narrator's voice returns. The assaulting force entered the fight with the advantage of numbers, positioning, and training. In the first minute, all of those advantages were disrupted by a single improvised explosive device thrown by a 19-year-old soldier. The German assault group was no longer advancing. They were struggling to reorganize under unexpected resistance. And for the first time since the night began, the American squad had a fighting chance. Danny kept his rifle trained on the trees, watching for any sign of renewed attack. He knew the Germans would not retreat easily, but he also knew the line hadn't broken. For the moment, they held. The forest settled into a brief pause after the first exchange of fire. The smoke from Danny's improvised grenade drifted through the trees in thin layers, mixing with the cold air. The Germans had stopped advancing, but they had not withdrawn. Danny could hear them shifting positions, dragging bodies, and preparing for another attempt. He knew this wasn't over. A single explosive, no matter how effective, wouldn't end an assault of this size. Sergeant Lawton moved along the line, crouched low, checking each man's ammunition. O'Shea was down to 2 clips. Dalecki had 3. Johnson had 1 left. Danny himself had only what was in his bandolier, and even though it was diminishing quickly. The squad was holding for now, but they were not equipped for a long engagement. Danny kept his eyes forward, scanning between the trees for movement. He could still make out several German silhouettes, some kneeling, some prone, some repositioning behind thick trunks. Their officer was alive and giving orders, his voice low but firm. The assault group was reorganizing, trying to restore cohesion after the shock of the explosion. Lawton returned to Danny's position. "Your grenade bought us time," he said quietly. "But they'll try again. They won't leave without pushing through." Danny nodded. "They're shifting right. They're trying to regroup behind those 2 big pines." Lawton followed his line of sight. "I see them. They're planning a second push. They want to force us to fire early, then hit us from the left once we're low on ammunition." Dalecki leaned in. "We can't take another push like the first one. Not with what we've got left." His voice was steady, but his breathing showed the strain of the situation. Danny listened to the sounds again. Feet pressing into snow, metal clinking against metal. A muffled cry from a wounded man. Then the distinct, sliding noise of a machine gun being positioned. The Germans were preparing support fire. He alerted Lawton. "They're setting up an MG. Sounds like an MG-34. Lawton stiffened. "If they get that set up on a flank, they'll pin us down. No one will be able to reposition." The Germans continued working in the dark. Danny could see 2 of them taking up prone positions, while others moved barrels and ammunition belts into place. If the MG opened fire, the thin American line would be shredded in seconds. Lawton spoke again, calmer than the situation should allow. "We need to break them before they fire that thing. Once it's running, we're finished." Danny assessed the forest around him. He had nothing left like the grenade. No second device. Only his rifle and the limited ammunition he carried. The squad's remaining standard grenade was held by O'Shea, but throwing at risk revealing their position too early. He scanned the left side again. The Germans were closer there, less than 20 yards from the squad's flank. He spotted 3 men moving behind a fallen tree trunk, preparing to advance on Lawton's left position. Danny whispered urgently, "Left side, 3 men moving in. They're trying to cut us off." Lawton signaled Johnson and O'Shea to shift slightly, keeping low. Cover that gap. If they break through there, the whole line collapses. The Germans chose that moment to advance. Two soldiers rose from behind a tree and fired 3 quick shots toward the Americans. The muzzle flashes gave Danny his aim. He returned fire instantly, sending a clean shot that struck the lead German in the chest. The second dove to the ground, firing blindly. Delecki added 2 rounds, forcing the remaining flank attackers to retreat behind cover. But then the sound Danny feared arrived. The MG-34 opened with a sudden burst, sending a tight stream of gunfire across the forest. The rounds struck bark, wood, and snow, showering Danny and the others with splinters. The gunner adjusted his angle, searching for their exact positions through the darkness. "Stay down," Lawton snapped, pressing his back into the log. The machine gun swept the area a second time, cutting branches cleanly and shredding the ground. Danny kept his head low, counting the rhythm of the bursts. The MG-34 fired in short, controlled lines, 2 seconds on, pause, reposition, another 2 seconds. The gunner was skilled and patient. Delecki gritted his teeth. "We can't stay pinned like this. They'll close in while that thing keeps us down." Danny examined the angle of the fire. The MG was targeting the center of the line, not the left. The gunner didn't have their exact position yet. Danny realized the Germans were firing to create panic, not to neutralize them. They were preparing their main group to advance during the next burst. He saw movement behind the MG team. 5 figures stood up, ready to move once the gunner suppressed the Americans again. Danny turned to Lawton, speaking quickly. "They're going to push right on the next burst. If they close the distance, we can't stop them." Lawton looked across the line. His men were low on ammunition, pinned by the MG, and already exhausted. He made a decision with no hesitation. "We fire before they move. All rifles. Short bursts. If we disrupt them again, the MG loses its angle." He signaled with 3 taps on the log. 1, 2, 3. The squad rose just enough to aim. The MG-34 began its next burst. The Americans fired directly into the advancing German group. Danny squeezed the trigger 4 times and measured shots. 1 German collapsed instantly. Another stumbled backward. The remaining 3 scattered, diving behind the nearest cover. The MG gunner shifted fire in frustration, trying to locate the source of the shots. His aim went high, striking branches above Danny's head instead of the log line. Lawton shouted, "Keep them back. Don't let them regroup." Delecki fired twice more, sending the Germans deeper behind cover. Johnson hit one as he attempted to crawl forward. O'Shea used their last grenade, throwing it with a short, tight arc that landed behind the MG team. The explosion forced the gunner to roll away from the weapon, damaging his setup and forcing the assistant to drag him to safety. The forest went quiet again, except for the sound of men breathing hard and weapons being reloaded. The German's second push had collapsed under the focus fire. Danny lowered his rifle, frost forming around the edge of his breath. The MG had stopped. The assault group had stalled again. For the second time that night, the line held. But Danny knew it was temporary. The Germans were still out there, and they weren't finished. The forest remained quiet after the grenade blast and the second failed German advance. But the silence didn't carry relief. It carried tension. Danny looked out between the logs and could see shapes still shifting deeper in the trees. The Germans hadn't withdrawn. They were regrouping for another attempt, determined to push through the weakened American line. Sergeant Lawton used the brief pause to assess the squad's condition. Johnson had a graze wound on his upper arm, but could still fire. O'Shea was breathing hard, shaken from throwing the last grenade and from almost being hit during the machine gun sweep. Delecki checked his ammunition again. Only 6 rounds left in his last clip. Danny had a similar amount. Lawton himself was down a half a magazine. They didn't discuss the numbers out loud. Everyone already understood how limited their chances were if the Germans launched another coordinated push. Danny kept watching the trees. The remnants of the MG-34 team had dragged the gun behind a large fallen trunk, and though they weren't firing, they were still there. He could hear faint movements, metal being adjusted, snow being brushed off equipment. The gunner was repairing the weapon or clearing the jam caused by the nearby grenade blast. Once that machine gun was operational again, the Germans would have cover to advance. Danny listened carefully. He recognized the pattern of German communication. Two officers, one giving steady instructions, the other coordinating the remaining riflemen for a final attempt. They were spreading out, trying to identify weak points in the American line. Lawton crouched behind the log and spoke in a low, controlled voice. "They're not done. They'll try one more time. When they start moving, we won't have much ammunition left. We fire only when we have a clear target." Dalecki nodded. "If the MG comes back up, we're finished." Danny knew this was true. Without grenades, without extra magazines, and without reinforcements anywhere nearby, they were fighting with endurance alone. The only reason they had survived this long was because the Germans were forced to reorganize twice. But the next assault would be cleaner. The enemy would not make the same mistakes. The forest shifted again. Danny saw 3 Germans moving on the far right, crouched low, rifles ready. Another group of 4 advanced up the center with more discipline than before. The German officer from earlier stood behind them, signaling with his hand, keeping their line tight and their spacing controlled. Their tactics had adjusted. They were coming in smaller elements, trying to test the Americans' limited firepower. Lawton whispered, "Everyone stay low. They want us to waste rounds." The Germans moved deliberately, advancing one step at a time, stopping frequently to listen. Danny could hear their boots crunching softly in the frost, could see the faint outlines of their helmets through the darkness. Their movements were slower, but more dangerous. This time they intended to get close enough to overwhelm the position by sheer proximity. O'Shea fired first. A single German approached too close, stepping into clear view. The shot struck the man in the chest, dropping him instantly. But as soon as the rifle cracked, the Germans opened fire from 3 directions. Bullets tore through branches above the squad, sending fragments down on them. Lawton pressed himself against the earth, raising his rifle only enough to return fire with 2 controlled shots. Danny took aim at a German moving to flank left. He steadied his breath, fired once, and saw the man drop behind a tree. 2 more Germans moved to replace him. Danny fired again, but missed. He hesitated before using another round. His ammunition was nearly gone. The MG-34 clattered once, an attempt to chamber a round, but it failed to fire. The Germans behind it were still repairing the gun. Danny knew when it came back online, they'd lose their last chance. Dalecki shouted over the gunfire, "They're grouping on the right. 6 of them." Danny turned and saw the group closing in. They were 15 yards away, using every tree for cover. He lifted his rifle, fired once, and struck one of them, but the remaining attackers pushed forward. Johnson joined the defense, firing his last 2 rounds before ducking back behind the log. O'Shea's rifle clicked empty. He reached for another clip, but found none left. The German officer raised his arm and shouted a single command, "Vorwärts!" They surged forward in a final coordinated advance. Lawton fired, then fired again, but their numbers were too high and the squad's ammunition too low. Dalecki tried to hit the officer, but had to drop behind cover as bullets tore into the wood in front of him. Danny felt the pressure of the situation collapse into a single fact. They were seconds away from being overrun. He scanned the ground, his breath rapid, searching for anything that could help. Then his eyes met the crater where his homemade grenade had exploded earlier. The blast radius was larger than he expected. The fragmentation had spread through trees for several yards in unpredictable directions. That blast was the only reason they were still alive. And if the Germans believed a second device existed, if they feared another explosion, they might halt, even briefly. Danny turned to Lawton. "Sergeant, they think we have more explosives." Lawton fired another round. "We don't. You used the only one." "I know," Danny said. "But they don't." Danny grabbed an empty ammo pouch, filled it with rocks and scrap metal from the ground, and tied it shut with wire from his pack. He held in his hand and made eye contact with Dalecki. "What the hell are you doing?" Dalecki asked. "Buying us time." Danny rose, just enough to look like he was preparing to throw something heavy and explosive. He lifted his arm high and swung the pouch back, making sure the Germans saw the silhouette of an object being primed. The German officer saw it immediately. His reaction was instant and loud. Granite. Deckung. German soldiers dove to the ground, pressed behind trees, or dropped flat into the snow, expecting another blast. Danny threw the decoy as far as he could. It landed with a dull thud. The Germans froze. No explosion came, but those 4 seconds of hesitation gave the Americans exactly what they needed. Lawton shouted, "Fire now!" The squad used their last rounds to strike the attackers while they were prone and disorganized. Danny fired his remaining shots with precise aim. Dalecki emptied his final clip. Johnson recovered one dropped magazine from a fallen comrade and used it to cover the right side. The German line buckled. The assault collapsed. Those still able to move retreated back into the trees, dragging wounded with them. Some shouted in panic, others in confusion. The MG-34 crew abandoned the gun entirely. Within seconds, the forest fell quiet again, not from peace, but from the enemy finally breaking contact. Danny lowered his rifle and exhaled for the first time in what felt like minutes. His chest rose and fell with sharp breaths. Frost had gathered in the folds of his collar. His hands were stiff, his fingers numb, but he kept them around his rifle out of habit. Lawton looked down the line, confirming the squad was still intact. "You saved us again," he said to Danny. "That blast, and whatever you just threw, they didn't know the difference." Danny didn't respond right away. He stared at the dark tree line where the Germans had vanished. He knew how close they had come. He knew the decoy wouldn't have worked if not for the power of the original explosion. And he knew the grenade he made in silence, while others laughed, had changed the outcome of the entire night. The squad sat behind the logs, breathing hard, waiting for another movement. But none came. For now, they had survived. The forest did not return to calm immediately. The minutes after the German withdrawal were filled with the smaller sounds that came when adrenaline began to fade. Heavy breathing, the muffled click of empty rifles being checked again, the rustle of coats as the men adjusted their positions. No one spoke at first. They stayed low, watching the trees, waiting to confirm the assault group was truly gone and not preparing another approach in silence. Danny kept his rifle ready, even though he had no ammunition left. His hands were shaking from the cold and from the strain of the last hour. The improvised grenade had done its work. The decoy had bought precious seconds, and the squad's final rounds had stopped the last push. But the possibility of another attack lingered until enough time passed for everyone to feel the shift in the forest. After nearly 15 minutes of stillness, Lawton finally straightened. "They've pulled back," he said quietly. "They won't try again tonight." The squad slowly rose from behind the log line. Their movements were stiff, deliberate, and cautious. The air was colder now, settling sharply into their coats and gloves as the immediacy of the fight faded. Danny stepped forward a few feet and looked into the direction the Germans had retreated. There were no shadows moving, no shifting figures, no sound except the occasional creak of trees shifting under cold wind. O'Shea sank down against a tree and let out a long breath. "I thought they had us on that last push." Dalecki wiped frost and with splinters off his cheek. "If Mercer hadn't thrown that thing earlier, they would have rolled right over us." Danny didn't respond. He didn't know what to say. He just looked at the ground, his breath hanging in the air, and focused on the shape of the crater left by his homemade grenade. The blast radius was larger than he expected. The shrapnel marks on nearby tree trunks showed how far the fragments had traveled. The device had functioned with more force than he had predicted. Lawton walked up beside him and examined the crater. He crouched down, picking up a fragment of the makeshift casing, a bent, jagged piece of metal with sharp edges. He turned it over in his gloved hand. "You built this out of scraps," he said, "and it hit like something factory-made." Danny kept his eyes on the crater. "I didn't know it would work that well." "It worked when it mattered," Lawton replied. "That's what counts." The squad slowly moved forward to check for any wounded Germans left behind. They found none. The assault group had moved quickly, carrying away anyone who could still be moved. It was a common practice in these night operations. No one wanted to leave men behind for the enemy to question or identify. They returned to their line, keeping a close guard. A messenger from the rear arrived shortly after dawn, slipping through the trees with a radio that finally regained signal. The sky grew lighter, turning from deep gray to pale blue, revealing the frozen forest floor and the scattered debris of the night's fighting. When word reached the platoon headquarters, 2 engineers were sent to inspect the damage. They approached carefully, wearing heavy coats and carrying toolkits. One of them knelt beside the crater, examining the fragments with quiet concentration. "What kind of grenade was this?" the engineer asked. Danny hesitated before answering. "It wasn't issued. I made it. From scrap. We didn't have enough grenades." The engineers exchanged a look, but said nothing for a moment. One of them picked up a fragment and inspected the weld marks. The casing had fractured in several consistent patterns that suggested controlled fragmentation, even though the materials were irregular. "You welded this by hand?" the engineer asked. "Yes," Danny replied. "I shaped the fragments with a file. Used a German igniter." The engineer nodded slowly. "Well, whatever you did here, it's effective. Very effective." The second engineer added quietly, "Ordnance Corps might want to report on this." Danny didn't react. He wasn't thinking about recognition or credit. He kept remembering how the Germans hesitated after the blast, how their lines broke, how the squad survived because of those seconds. His goal had never been invention. It had been survival. Lawton approached the engineers. "The kid saved the whole line with that thing," he said. "We wouldn't be standing here without it." The engineers made notes and gathered several fragments before moving on. Once they left, the squad resumed securing their small section of the forest. The sun rose higher, though the light remained weak behind clouds. The cold did not ease, but the danger had passed for the moment. Danny walked to a fallen stump and sat down, finally letting the exhaustion sink into his body. His hands were still shaking. Dalecki sat beside him. "You know," Dalecki said quietly, "I gave you hell about that grenade. But if you hadn't made it, we wouldn't have made it." Danny looked at him but didn't answer. His mind replayed the night step by step. The footsteps approaching, the hiss of the igniter, the blast, the machine gun, the decoy, the last rounds fired. Everything felt compressed into a single, continuous moment. Lawton joined them. "You did more than your job tonight. That device changed the outcome for everyone on this line." Danny lowered his eyes. "I just didn't want us to run out of options." The sergeant nodded once, a gesture of respect rarely given. Sometimes one idea is enough. As the morning advanced, the temperature held steady, and the forest remained quiet. The squad received their next set of instructions: hold position until relieved. Reinforcements would arrive by midday. Until then, they were to maintain watch. Danny stood once more at the log line. The crater from his grenade remained visible in the snow, a reminder of how close they came to being overrun. He stared at it for a long time, not with pride, but with a sense of clarity. His efforts, improvised and doubted, had made the difference on a night when the squad had no margin for error. The narrator's tone settles into a calm, factual cadence. The Germans never attempted another assault on that position. The damage done by Danny Mercer's homemade explosive, combined with the squad's final defense, broke their momentum and forced them to withdraw. In the reports that followed, the incident was noted as an example of adaptive field improvisation under limited supply conditions. For the men who were present, it was simply the reason they were still alive. Danny remained at his position, rifle empty but held firmly, watching the forest as daylight settled in. The night was over. The danger had passed, but the memory of every moment would stay with him long after the forest grew quiet again.